Welcome to TESO Consulting Group's DEI podcast series, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadow of Resistance. I'm Dr. Tonya Breland.
And I am Erika Leek.
Welcome back.
Welcome back, everybody.
We're so happy to be here again, and we're so glad that you joined us again. I'm Tonya Breland.
And I'm Erika Leek. And this is our podcast, Why Is It So Hard? Shining Through the Shadows of Resistance. And in our podcast together, we just challenge each other to really think about some of the ways that our society prevents us from being socially just and free. But we also talk a lot about how we can be the change that we wish to see in our society. So we invite you to listen in and join our conversation.
Yeah, we hope this challenges you to be the change that you want to see. So today our topic is we're stronger together. Together we're stronger. Yeah.
Yes,
so, we were talking about like what we should, present today, and we started thinking about this concept of individualism and collectivism.
Yeah.
And, some people may not really know what that is. You want to talk a little bit about like what we mean when we say individualism versus collectivism?
Sure. So if we think about it, as the author Zaretta Hammond has explained it being on a continuum. So on the one end, on the extreme end, we have individualism, right? So in the individualistic frame or context, people kind of do things by themselves. There's an emphasis on independence and individual achievement and competition and those kinds of things, and being self-reliant, and the idea that you're supposed to take care of yourself in order to get ahead in society. But then on the opposite end of that same continuum, there's an emphasis on interdependence and group success. Collaboration is huge in a collectivist world, and also relationships matter. And if one wins, we all win. In fact, one doesn't win, we all win together. So there's this really this opposite ends of a continuum that says either the one, the individual, or everybody, the collective.
Yeah, and what's interesting about this whole individualism versus collectivism, our country is really kind of rooted in individualism. Sure. You may have heard the term rugged individualism, and it really is just kind of that, that notion that each individual is really responsible for themselves. And what we find in the research is that, groups that tend to come from European countries tend to be more on the individualism side. And, other, ethnic groups who have, African background or Latin roots, or Asian, Middle Eastern, and even Slavic cultures tend to be more collectivist. And so that really gets to be kind of interesting in this country that has like a growing population of, people of color, and how does this dominant narrative of individualism, meet with people who come with more of a collectivist type of approach. Now, let me caution you, it doesn't mean that everybody is fully individualistic and everybody's fully collectivist in their thinking and their way of being, but we're somewhere along that continuum.
Yes. I think a really good example of this is sometimes we see this in like cuisine and the way that people engage to eat, right? So I can remember going to a restaurant, and I feel like it was maybe a Moroccan restaurant. And, we all sat down, like there were no individual seats, like we all kind of sat down around on these like large pillows, and the food was brought out together. So you ordered what everybody wanted. We all agreed what we wanted, and the food came out, communal style. And it was such a difference between what I had been exposed to in other restaurants where, you ordered for yourself and you ate, what was on your plate, right? So even sometimes we see this in different ways that we experience other cultures. We see the difference in the individual versus a collective. Yes.
Yeah. And it's really interesting because, while America really values individualism, as two Black women, we find ourselves when we're training really leaning towards that collectivist, approach.
Yeah.
And it's natural for us.
Yeah.
Like it's really natural. And we notice that if we're training with audiences that are not predominantly audiences of color, it's not uncommon for those audience members to be a little like annoyed that we want them to work together.
Yeah.
Like we hear that.
Yes,
You're like,
we do.
oh, we have to work together. It's like, yeah, and for us, it's just kind of a part of like how we do things.
Yeah.
Because this is kind of how we were. It's very much a part of, it's ingrained in us, quite honestly.
Yeah,
in many ways.
I was thinking about that as you were talking, like how the group was very much a part of our family and our church life, growing up. There was this idea that you represented both. And when achievement happened, like in our family, it was like, yes, the Newmans, and my father said a lot, when you leave this house, you represent
That's
me.
correct.
And
Right.
it wasn't, so there was never this idea of you being out there by yourself.
Right.
It was, this is what we do,
Right.
and
Right.
even I can remember even thinking about where to go to college. I had to think about, it wasn't just about where I wanted to go. It was about how is where you're going to go going to impact the finances of this group. How is it going to impact, even sort of the routine? Like I had to really think about my family. It wasn't just about Erika going off. It was very much about like, how does this affect the Newman clan? And it was also like that in a church. I came up in a traditionally Black church, and groupthink was huge. We did a lot of things together, even down to, I can remember having to rehearse in our teenage choir, standing up together.
Yes.
Like, nobody,
Yes.
even if you were a soloist, right? You had to stand up with everybody else.
I forgot about
yes,
that.
but
Yes.
think about how collective that mindset is. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good example. I completely
Like
forgot
we had to
about that.
rehearse that.
Yes.
It wasn't even like,
You're absolutely right. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And what happens, I think, sometimes because there is this kind of dominant narrative around individualism, we'll hear people say things like, pull yourself up from your bootstraps or whatever. It's like, I worked hard to get to where I am, and and they resent, anything that seems to push against, this notion of individualism.
Yes.
And, while it's very much a part of American culture, I think that the challenge with that is, America is filled with people of color, and that may not be the way that they do things. And also, when we think about like differences in who has access sometimes and who doesn't have access, I think sometimes that can get lost in this narrative of individualism.
Yeah.
And it's, it can be dicey to have those conversations.
It can be, especially when, the communal is seen as deficit.
Right.
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 Especially when, the communal or the collective, so we think about, an intergenerational family, and, in certain contexts, if you're raised to sort of go out and make it on your own, then a kid that's being raised in an intergenerational family where we might have 2 or 3 generations, living together, working together, supporting each other, providing resources for the collective, from the outside, that might look like, sort of this deficit of crowdedness and poverty and, like all of these other types of language that we hear around, but it could be a large, tight-knit, family that supports each other. And, so think about the wealth of experiences that a kid would have if we have not only our siblings and our parents, but we've got our grandparents there. Maybe there's an auntie there, supporting each other
Right.
through life.
We also see that in families that come to this country. So, a number of years ago, my husband and I were doing a marriage conference at a church that was predominantly African, and I think the vast majority were either from Nigeria or from Ghana, but some may have come from other countries in Africa as well. And a question came up in that session about some of the conflict that the couples have around sending money back home. And so, we having been in America with this kind of like individualistic kind of, dominant narrative, if you will, the way that we responded was not aligned to a very collectivist perspective. And so, we had a break. I remember having a break, and the pastor of this particular church where we were doing this marriage conference, spoke to us and shared, so I just want to give you a little bit of background. In our cultures, it is expected that we, if our families, are here in America, it is expected that when our families work, that our families send money back home. That is the expectation. And so that whole collectivist mindset, and I've seen that in other cultures as well, which is very different than what we see here, where it's a lot of like on your own kind of thinking. And it's sort of like, that narrative, that dominant narrative, really clashes with the narrative of many cultures that are now represented here in our country. And I think it's something that's worth noting and talking about, which is why we're having this conversation today.
Yeah, I even think about some of the language around millennials and what is the new generation? Is it
Gen Z?
Gen Z,
I think.
Gen Z, right? And so there's
the young ones.
The young ones, right? that are kind of coming out and finishing college and trying to start their lives. And there's a lot of I'm always interested. I have a 26-year-old. And she did move out to Arizona, but during the pandemic she moved home, which I'm totally fine with. And I hear a lot of conversation, all of these really big reports around how Gen Zers are not able to buy their own home, or they're not able to get out on their own. And part of my challenge with that is like, okay, so if they need additional help, or if they need additional support, in this really tough economy, or if they just need additional resources, that's okay, right? That's okay. But there's this, but the tenor of the conversation is the expectation that at a certain age, you'll just be out on your own, right? Rather than even, I will say that I know that there's going to come a time when my daughter is, will leave and everything like that. And I'm okay with that, but I'm also okay with her, contributing to, our family life as well. Like, I'm just really, it just really strikes me as interesting around the sort of the tone of the rhetoric around like, they're not leaving yet. Right. They're still at home.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, isn't that okay right now?
A society doesn't make it okay.
That's right.
But as you were talking about your daughter, I was remembering my own grandparents. So, they lived in Chicago, which is where I was born, and they had a 3-family house. And what I remember as a little girl, when we would go to visit, my grandmother's mother also lived in their apartment or their house. And then above them was my grandfather's sister and his oldest brother. And above them was kind of rotating. So at one point there was, their son and daughter-in-law. There's another point that there was his younger brother who actually I learned was actually his nephew, but that's a whole nother story.
Another episode.
Yeah, another episode, right?
Family secrets.
Yeah. But but growing up, we began to know that side of the family because of how they lived. And so while my grandparents were the ones that owned the structure, I don't know if his sister and brother paid rent, or was that just so that the whole family had a place to live at different points in times, in their
Yeah.
lives. And, it was just really just the norm. It was just how they lived, how we came to like
Yeah.
know like living situations. It didn't seem awkward at any point or odd or strange. It was just like the norm, and they looked out for one another that way. And that whole collective, that's where you see that example of collectivism, in our family, which was really, really very powerful, I think.
Yeah, my father grew up in Philadelphia, in North Philadelphia, and when I was younger, we moved out to New Jersey. But my father used to talk a lot about, so there were the Newmans and there were the Odricks, and they were very close. And anytime my dad had a memory about, his life growing up, it involved either the Newman, the brothers and sisters, or the Odricks, who are his cousins. And what I started to realize as an adult was just how supportive that structure was. It was about, it was a few blocks of family. And so through that, they received, referrals for jobs, help with education, childcare, food, financial resources, like all of that was available within the collective.
Yes.
And how powerful is that
Yeah.
for families? Because it's not easy, right? When you strike out and you're on your own. But how powerful is that for
Yeah.
the families to just support each other? And we see this particularly, like you said, with cultures or people who come over from other cultures. And we see it also too with marginalized communities that have, a lack of resources, and they develop a collective.
And
We
it's
do,
really
and
important.
it's very important. It's very important. It's a lifeline in very many instances.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's I think challenging is when we think about like how schools are set up.
Yeah.
Teachers teach in isolation. Occasionally you'll see team teaching happening, but that's usually like because there are students with disabilities in the
Yes.
classroom, and there's a teacher who's certified to work with those students, with disabilities. And that's where you might see collaboration, and you might see a move towards like professional learning communities. But many times you don't really see that. And a lot of teachers are kind of like out there on an island, really trying to, create environments, learning environments that are positive for students. And, but we also see that same thing in the classrooms. So, if the teachers are teaching in isolation, students are also learning in isolation in many ways, meaning they are, you can go into a classroom and look at the seating. So how are students sitting in that classroom?
Yeah.
It's not uncommon to still see, and we had this growing up, rows and rows of students,
Yes.
which, really speaks to this independence, this individualism. And while there's some merit there, ultimately with this growing population of students of color, and, in our state, more than half, nearly 60% of our students are students of color.
Yeah.
And so what that should mean is that there should be some adaptation in the classroom, so that isolation and independence piece should really be more of a collectivist piece, where you see the desk, for example, grouped together, where instruction is centered around, the collaborative problem solving and, working together as a group, because together they're stronger.
That's right.
You
That's
know?
right. I mean, literally, there's so much research around how social the brain is, right? So not only in school, but also at work, how important that is. I think we're seeing that now too. A lot of teachers, particularly post-COVID, talked a lot to us around how kids are really struggling with social skills. And so because of that, there's this resistance to put kids in groups or have them work together. And what we know is that, if they don't get a chance to practice it, they're not going to learn it, right? And so resisting the need or the practice of allowing kids to work through, to problem solve together and to have conversations. One, it goes against how the brain is wired because the brain is so social. We learn from each other all the time.
Right.
But also it kind of stops them from learning the practice of group work, teamwork, collaboration, all those skills that they need in the 21st century, relationship building, all of those skills that used to be called soft skills, but all of those skills that they need to be successful.
I mean, quite honestly, it has worked for us. So, I started TESO Consulting Group 11 years ago, almost 12. I started by myself, kind of like, okay, I want to start this business and it was really tough. But in the last, year and a half that you and I, almost 2 years that we've been working together, that was like the best decision.
Yeah.
Working together, we are so much stronger.
We are.
We're so much more successful collaborating and working together. It's like we have, diverse perspectives. We're not the same people, but there are a lot of ways.
Even everybody says we look alike.
I know.
We don't. We don't think we do.
Don't. We kind of have short curly hair.
That's it.
We're both black, but we're not the same. We don't look
quite
the
striking,
same.
I might add. Right. But we don't look alike. Okay.
Just a little levity. But really, I've found that this is a much better business because of you.
Oh.
And because we get to collaborate together, and we do indeed collaborate on every aspect of what we do.
Yes, we do.
And we find that it's more successful that way.
Yes.
I remember the very first time we were prepping for a training, and I was like, oh, I have to do this training. And it was one that I was doing independently, and you said, well, why don't we work on it together? And I was like, I never thought of that. I mean, it made sense, obviously, but I was just so used to working independently and struggling that when you suggested that, do you remember that?
I do remember that.
It was almost like, it was so, it was a game changer. But then I love to collaborate, and I just didn't, I was so used to having to do it by myself, because there's also this narrative about, like, build your own business. And it's nice to build your own business, but you're going to struggle when you're not doing it together. I mean, you don't have to struggle, but there's power in the partnership.
There is. And I think another piece of that is that the work environments where we came out of really did it didn't lend itself to collaboration. And there was a lot of challenge around who got credit for what. And so it did force you to work by yourself and all of that. But I do remember that.
Silos.
Yeah, a lot of silos. But I do remember that and I remember that collaboration. And I thought, this was first of all, it was fun.
Yes.
I really enjoyed it. And it was one of the few times where I was like, God, I'm really enjoying this. So sometimes you're really good at something, because I'm sure you could have put that workshop together without a problem. But sometimes you can do it, but sometimes you don't enjoy it. And so I think I enjoyed that so much.
Yeah, I did too.
And I enjoyed that so much.
Has become the way that we do business.
Yes.
And we're much better for it.
Yes.
The business is much better for it. And I think our reach and our impact is better. It allows us to be more innovative and to maybe take risks that we may not have taken. Because there's safety here. And I think that when we create that environment where people are collaborating, whether it's in the workplace or in the classroom, where there's collaboration, there's an opportunity for problem solving, diversity of thought, which is really important, I think, in whatever work that needs to be done. Really just helping with, building communication skills, which is something that we see with students in particular.
Yes.
You know,
I think even with us, though, the communication, sometimes you say something, I'm like, that is so good.
I do that too with
That
you.
is so good.
Yeah.
I love that phrase, or I love the
Right.
way that you
Right.
just said that, or listening to the way, like, sometimes you could have like a concept in your head, and then I can have a concept in my head, and then you'll verbalize it. It's like, yes,
Right.
that's exactly it.
Right.
So, but had we not,
Had that conversation.
yeah, I
Right.
would have never heard it. I
Yeah.
think also too, like when we're collaborating together, and I think this happens with kids, and I think it happens on teams where there's really great communication and collaboration. There is a motivation to get there, to work, to work together, because even though we collaborate, there are times that we're like, oh, that's a nice necklace. Where'd you get that? And then we'll chat. Well, hey, get back to work.
Right.
But that connection and
Right.
that bonding,
Right.
I think it increases the motivation to actually get that work done, right? And
Yeah.
then I think, like you started off with, the outcomes are just so much better.
Yes.
They're just so much
Yes.
better,
Yeah, I mean, think about like classroom projects, for
Yeah.
example. So when a student has to work independently on a project, they have a myopic view.
Yeah.
This is, it's really only what they've learned
Yes.
about something. But when you bring in the collective, and the collective says, here's a piece of information that I found, and here's
Yes.
something that might be really
Yes.
valuable to this, you've got a more robust product here.
That's right. That's right.
And not only that, the kids have learned something from each of their colleagues that they otherwise might not have learned.
I think another huge piece, and I think, as we sort of, wind up our conversation or wrap up our conversation, I think there's an issue of accountability as well.
Yes.
That's really important and it matters hugely in a group. So as a teacher
And in life.
Right. So as a teacher, or even as a manager of a professional team, or a work group, that group will hold each other accountable in a way that you won't necessarily have to do that as facilitator of that group.
Right.
And that's a really powerful thing,
is.
especially if you've ever been in a classroom where one kid has, said to another kid, don't do that, or don't talk like that, or come on, we got to get this done. That accountability matters hugely because that's part of the benefit of the collective.
Right. And there's a reduction in the stress and the workload.
Yes.
So, that example that I gave with me prepping for that training, that you said, hey, we can do that together, even though it was a training that I had to deliver independently. By us doing it together, that reduced the stress for me, because I was feeling like, oh my goodness, I don't have that much time and I've got to get this done. And, and you're like, we can do this together, and like, it's like, oh, okay. So then I didn't feel like I had to come up with everything, because first of all, I trust your intellect, because you're extremely intelligent.
Oh, so
and
that's why we're a good pair.
Exactly. We're just loving on each other today. But it helped. It really helped to reduce the stress and the workload.
Yeah.
The workload is that much better, and even now with the work that we're doing, and we're expanding our team, thankfully.
Yes.
And as we expand our team, we now, some of our stress gets to be reduced because we have others to help us with the workload.
That's right.
And that's really important. And so, let's kind of, bring this back around to just this whole piece around the individualism versus collectivism. It's not to say that there may not be a time where working alone and independently isn't important or necessary, but I think that really strongly considering, where can there be collaboration? Where can there be, where can we bring the collective together with, whatever the task is? I think that there's power in that we otherwise may not think about.
Absolutely. Just in that example, the collective planned the training, but you delivered it, as an individual. And so, but you shined. So we all, contributed to that, and it benefited us all.
Right.
And so, in this conversation, we hope that you, found or thought about some ways that, the collective, that you could actually, benefit from or even utilize or create a collective that will, just sort of provide support for the members of a community. And when you do, let us know. Let us
Yeah.
know.
We'd love to hear your feedback,
We
as
really would.
always. Again, thank you for joining us.
Thank
I'm
you.
Tonya,
And I'm Erika.
and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Take care, everyone.